I was sitting on an airplane, 3 hours into a flight with nothing else to do, reading the debut novel everyone in publishing had been talking about for months, when I hit a paragraph on page 41 that made me put the book down completely and stare at the seat back in front of me. I had written that paragraph, not something like it. That exact paragraph, nearly word for word, sitting inside a novel published under a name I had never heard of, by an author my own literary agent represented, 6 years after she told me the manuscript containing it wasn't ready for the market. My hands went cold around the paperback. I remember glancing at the woman in the seat beside me, half expecting her to notice something had changed in the air around me, though of course she just kept scrolling through something on her phone, utterly unaware that the man 3 rows up had unknowingly become part of the strangest, most disorienting moment of my professional life. My name is Claire. I teach high school English, which means I've spent my career trying to convince teenagers that careful, patient revision is worth the effort, that good writing takes time and honest feedback to become what it's capable of being. I believe that completely about my own work too. For 6 years, right up until the moment on that airplane when I started to understand that not ready yet had never actually meant what I thought it meant. I finished my first novel 7 years ago, written mostly in the margins of a full-time teaching career. Early mornings before school, weekend afternoons while my husband Marcus took our dog on long walks specifically so I could have the house quiet. It took me almost 4 years to write that first draft, a family drama with a central mystery I was genuinely proud of, the kind of book I'd wanted to read myself for years and finally decided to write when I couldn't find quite the right version of it on any shelf. I remember finishing the final chapter at our kitchen table at nearly midnight on a Tuesday, printing the whole manuscript out just to hold the physical weight of it, for years of early mornings finally assembled into something whole. I signed with Diane Wexler, a senior literary agent at a well-regarded boutique agency, after what felt, at the time, like the best possible outcome for a first-time novelist. She'd read the full manuscript within 2 weeks of my query, called me personally rather than sending a form email, and spent almost an hour on the phone describing specific scenes she loved, characters she found genuinely compelling, a central twist she called exactly the kind of thing that makes an agent excited to go to work in the morning. "I've read a lot of manuscripts this year," she told me during that first call, her voice warm and unhurried in a way that felt like genuine enthusiasm rather than a sales pitch. "Most of them, I can tell within the first chapter whether they'll ever be ready. Yours, I finished in one sitting and immediately wanted to talk to you. That doesn't happen often." I hung up that call and cried in my kitchen, the particular disbelieving joy of finally having someone with real industry knowledge validate something I'd worked on in near total isolation for years. The first year of working with Diane was good, genuinely good, and I want to be clear about that because I think it's important to understand this didn't begin as an obviously exploitative relationship. She requested several rounds of revisions that first year, each one specific, thoughtful, clearly aimed at making the manuscript stronger rather than simply different. I remember one particular note about my protagonist's brother, a secondary character I'd underwritten, and how reworking his arc according to her suggestions genuinely deepened the entire back half of the book. She'd send detailed editorial letters, sometimes running 4 or 5 pages, walking through specific scenes with the kind of close attention I hadn't received from anyone besides myself in 4 years of solitary drafting. I trusted her completely. I had every reason to. The revisions kept multiplying over the following 2 years, though, in a way that started to feel less like refinement and more like something else entirely, though I couldn't have named what at the time. Diane would request a specific structural change, reworking a particular twist, expanding a secondary character's arc, shifting a key scene setting from a city apartment to a lake house, always framed as the change that would finally make the manuscript ready to go out to publishers. I made every single change she asked for, meticulously, gratefully, believing each round brought me closer to the goal I'd been working toward for years. I remember one specific note, during what I now think of as the third year, where she asked me to completely rework the reveal about my protagonist's brother. Not just refine it, but rebuild the entire mechanism of how, and when the reader learns the truth about why he'd actually disappeared years earlier. It took me nearly 4 months of dedicated evening and weekend work to restructure that reveal to her specifications, moving it earlier in the book, adding an entirely new subplot to support it properly. I remember feeling exhausted but genuinely proud of the result, certain this particular round of revisions represented real, meaningful improvement rather than just more delay. Somewhere around the third year, I remember mentioning to Marcus, almost in passing, that I'd started keeping dated copies of every draft I sent Diane, along with her revision emails, mostly just out of the organizational habit I developed as a teacher who needed to track student drafts carefully. I had no idea at the time how significant that simple habit would eventually become. I learned about Nathaniel Boyd, one of Diane's other clients, through an industry newsletter I subscribed to, the kind of casual professional reading that comes with pursuing publication seriously. Nathaniel was an author I genuinely admired, someone whose earlier novels I'd taught excerpts from in my own classroom. And the newsletter mentioned he was working on a new book after a public, well-documented period of writer's block following a commercially disappointing previous release. I remember feeling a small flicker of professional camaraderie reading that, nothing more, the ordinary interest of one aspiring writer following an established one's career. Around year 4, something shifted in Diane's engagement with my manuscript, though it happened gradually enough that I didn't fully register it as a pattern at the time. Feedback came slower. Requested revisions became vaguer, less specific than the sharp, targeted notes she'd given in earlier years. Meetings became harder to schedule, pushed back repeatedly for reasons that always sounded reasonable individually, a busy submission season, an author tour, a family emergency I felt guilty even feeling frustrated about. I started privately wondering, quietly, whether my manuscript would ever actually go out to publishers at all. Though I didn't yet suspect any deliberate obstruction, just the ordinary difficulty of the industry I'd heard so much about from other aspiring writers. Marcus, supportive of my writing for years, but always a little more skeptical of the publishing industry's opacity than I was, gently voiced doubt one evening over dinner. Has she actually submitted it anywhere in the last 2 years? He asked. Or is she just asking you to keep revising it forever? She says the market's difficult right now. I told him, repeating language I'd absorbed so completely I didn't even question it anymore. She wants it to be as strong as possible before it goes out. It's been 4 years, Claire, he said, not unkindly, just honestly. How much stronger does one manuscript need to get? I didn't have a good answer for him that night. I don't think I wanted to sit with the question closely enough to find one. The announcement about Nathaniel's comeback novel broke about 6 months later, described in trade press as a dramatic departure from his previous work, a sprawling family drama built around a central mystery that unfolds through alternating timelines. I remember reading the brief plot description in that same industry newsletter and feeling a strange, unplaceable unease I couldn't identify at the time. Something between recognition and déjà vu that I dismissed almost immediately as professional envy, an aspiring writer's ordinary discomfort at seeing someone else's success announced in exactly the genre she herself was struggling to break into. Diane's final rejection of my own manuscript came not long after that. In a phone call I still remember with uncomfortable clarity. She was warm, sympathetic, careful with her language in a way that somehow made the actual content of what she was saying even harder to argue with. After 6 years of development, she said, I don't think this manuscript is commercially viable in the current market. I want you to understand that doesn't mean the writing isn't good, Claire. Sometimes a book is simply ahead of its time, or behind it. I think you should consider this an incredibly valuable creative exercise and start thinking about what you want to write next. I cried after that call too. A very different kind of crying than the joyful tears from 6 years earlier. I remember Marcus holding me on our couch that night while I tried to articulate something I couldn't quite name yet. Not just grief over the rejection itself, but a creeping, unexamined sense that something about the entire arc of those 6 years didn't add up the way it should have. I put the manuscript away after that. I told myself I was taking a break, the way writers are supposed to after a disappointment, though privately I wondered if I was simply done. If 6 years of increasingly specific revision requests followed by a gentle, devastating rejection was actually just an honest verdict on my own limitations as a writer. Then came the airplane, months later, a work conference requiring a cross-country flight, and Nathaniel Boyd's celebrated new novel, sitting in the seatback pocket of the airport bookstore, purchased on impulse, because I genuinely wanted to read the book everyone in publishing had been talking about for months. I settled in somewhere over the Midwest, coffee in hand, expecting nothing more complicated than an enjoyable flight read. Page 41 changed everything. A single paragraph, describing a specific memory the novel's protagonist has of her estranged brother teaching her to skip stones on a lake the summer their parents' marriage fell apart. The exact scene, nearly the exact language, that I had written into my own manuscript's crucial midpoint chapter, the same scene Diane had specifically asked me to develop further during our second year of revisions. I read that paragraph 4 times before I trusted myself to keep going. The specific verb choices, the particular rhythm of the sentence describing the stone's third skip across the water, a small, distinctive detail about the brothers' laugh that I remembered agonizing over for nearly an hour during my original drafting, trying to find exactly the right word. All of it sitting there on page 41 of a stranger's celebrated novel, in a form so close to my own that I genuinely could not convince myself it was accidental, however hard some panic part of my brain tried to talk me into that explanation. I sat frozen in my airplane seat for what felt like a very long time, rereading that paragraph over and over, trying to convince myself I was imagining a resemblance that wasn't actually there. But I know my own sentences. I've read them more times than any reasonable person should read their own unpublished work, obsessively, during 6 years of hoping they'd eventually mean something to someone beyond me. This wasn't resemblance. This was my writing, sitting inside someone else's published, celebrated novel. I didn't sleep much that entire flight. I kept the book open on my lap, unable to either keep reading normally or close it entirely, glancing back at that same paragraph every few minutes as if it might have changed on rereading. By the time I landed, I'd already decided I needed to go home and pull every old draft I'd saved, every dated revision email from Diane, and actually look closely at what I might be looking at. I spent the following weekend doing exactly that, spreading printed drafts across our dining room table, cross-referencing my own manuscript's evolution against Nathaniel's published novel chapter by chapter. What I found went far beyond a single paragraph. The lake house setting Diane had specifically asked me to shift my key scene to during year 3 appeared, nearly identically, as a central location in Nathaniel's novel. The particular structural twist she'd asked me to rework during year 4. The exact reveal about the protagonist brother's actual reason for disappearing that had taken me 4 months to properly restructure appeared, reorganized only slightly, as Nathaniel's own novel's central reveal. Several distinctive turns of phrase, specific enough that I couldn't imagine them arising independently, appeared scattered throughout his book, echoing lines from drafts I had sent Diane years earlier. I worked through that comparison methodically, the same careful, patient process I use grading student essays, color-coding matching passages, building an actual spreadsheet tracking which of my own revision rounds corresponded to which elements eventually appearing in Nathaniel's book. By Sunday evening, the pattern was undeniable even to my own cautious, self-doubting instincts. Nearly every major structural change Diane had requested from me over 4 years had a direct, traceable counterpart somewhere in Nathaniel's published novel. I showed Marcus the full comparison that same weekend, both of us sitting at that same dining room table late into the night, papers spread everywhere, his expression shifting from confusion to something colder and more focused the longer he read. He didn't say much at first, just kept flipping between pages, his jaw tightening incrementally with each new match he found on his own. "This isn't coincidence," he finally said, tapping one particular page where an entire paragraph from my draft and a paragraph from Nathaniel's published novel sat side by side, nearly identical. "Claire, this is your book. Parts of it, at least. Someone took parts of your book and put them in his. I keep trying to find an innocent explanation," I told him. "Some way this could just be a coincidence, or something I'm imagining because I'm still upset about the rejection." "Look at this," he said, pointing to the spreadsheet I'd built, the neat rows of matched revision dates against matched published passages. "You didn't imagine dates on emails, Claire. This isn't a feeling. This is documentation." Having Marcus see it so immediately, without any of my own accumulated self-doubt clouding his reaction, helped me trust my own perception in a way I hadn't fully been able to on my own. I'd spent 6 years being told, gently and repeatedly, that my judgment about my own manuscript's readiness wasn't to be trusted over Diane's professional assessment. Watching Marcus's uncomplicated, immediate recognition of what was actually in front of us started to loosen something that had tightened in me over those same 6 years. A former student of mine, now working as an assistant at a different literary agency, helped me get in touch with Priya Chandrasekharan, an assistant editor at the publishing house that had released Nathaniel's novel. I reached out carefully, framing my questions generally at first, asking about the novel's development process without immediately revealing why I was asking. Priya was cautious on our first call, understandably protective of internal publishing house information. "I can talk in general terms," she said, her voice careful over the phone, "but I need to be honest that there's a limit to what I'm comfortable sharing about a specific book's internal process." I understood completely and told her I only wanted to understand general timelines, nothing that would put her in a difficult position. But something in the conversation clearly troubled her enough that she volunteered more than I expected. "I probably shouldn't say this," she said, after a pause long enough that I could hear her deciding something on the other end of the line. "But there was something unusual about the manuscript's editorial history. A significant chunk of new structural material came in during a very late revision round, well after the point in the process where that kind of fundamental change typically happens. The editorial notes attributed it to what they called agent-guided development, rather than the author's own drafting process. I remember finding that phrasing strange at the time. I didn't think much more about it until you started asking these questions. How late in the process are we talking about?" I asked her. "Months after the manuscript was supposedly finished," she said. "We were already deep into copy editing on the original draft when this new material came in and reshaped nearly a third of the book. I remember our whole editorial team being a little surprised at the scope of it, though nobody questioned it publicly. Authors have breakthroughs. It happens. I just remember it feeling unusual at the time, and I never had a reason to think about it again until now." I told her the full story after that. The 6 years, the revision emails, the airplane discovery, the side-by-side comparisons spread across my dining room table. Priya went quiet for a long moment on the phone. "I need to think about how much I can actually help without putting my own position at risk," she finally said. "But I believe you. That timeline never made sense to me, and now I think I understand why." Marcus and I consulted an intellectual property attorney the following week, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia Ewan, who specialized in publishing disputes. She reviewed our comparison document, the dated drafts, Diane's own revision request emails, and told us something that steadied me considerably. Proving substantial similarity between creative works is a real, established legal framework, she said, and your documentation here is unusually strong for this kind of case. Most authors in your position don't have dated drafts and the agent's own written instructions specifically requesting the changes that later appear in the other book. You do. Over the following several weeks, Patricia's office helped us build a comprehensive comparison document, dated manuscript drafts alongside Nathaniel's published text, Diane's own revision request emails specifically directing changes that later appeared, nearly verbatim, in Nathaniel's novel, and Priya's account of the irregular late-stage development timeline. Watching that document take shape, page by page, was its own strange experience, validating and devastating in equal measure. Watching 6 years of not ready yet reassemble itself into something that finally made sense in the worst possible way. Patricia recommended something that surprised me at first. Rather than proceeding straight to a lawsuit or going public immediately, she suggested reaching out to Nathaniel Boyd directly, given the evidence suggesting he might genuinely be an unknowing party rather than a deliberate co-conspirator in Diane's actions. The revision timeline and the specific language of the editorial notes suggest he may have received this material from Diane without fully understanding where it originated, Patricia explained. If that's accurate, treating him purely as an adversary from the outset could be both legally and morally the wrong approach. I remember feeling genuinely uncertain about that recommendation. Some part of me wanted a clear villain, someone to be angry at without complication. But Patricia drafted a careful letter to Nathaniel's own attorney, laying out the comparison evidence and requesting a conversation before any further action. Nathaniel's response when it came wasn't what I expected. He agreed to meet in person at Patricia's office, along with his own attorney present. I remember sitting across that conference table from him, a man whose books I'd taught to teenagers, watching him work through the comparison document Patricia had prepared, page by page, his expression shifting from polite skepticism into something increasingly shaken. He kept flipping back and forth between pages, comparing dates, his jaw tightening more with each one. Diane called this material inspiration notes, he finally said, his voice quieter than I expected from the confident author photos I'd seen for years. I was deep in writer's block for almost 2 years after my last book underperformed. Genuinely deep. I couldn't write a page I liked. She started sending me these incredibly specific structural suggestions, character backstories, a particular twist, whole scenes practically outlined, more detailed than any agent notes I'd ever received before. I thought it was just exceptional agenting, the kind of hands-on development help I'd heard other authors talk about happening at certain agencies. I genuinely believed I was building something from those notes myself, that she was helping me find my way back into my own creative process. I had no idea they were someone else's actual manuscript. He pulled up his own email archive on his laptop right there in that conference room, cross-referencing dates against our own timeline, watching his own realization deepen in real time. His attorney leaned over to look at the screen with him, both of them going quiet. "This is dated the same week she told you the book wasn't commercially viable," he said, staring at his screen, his voice barely above a whisper now. "She was sending me your lake house scene almost the exact week she was telling you your manuscript wasn't ready. I didn't know. I need you to understand I genuinely didn't know where any of this was actually coming from." I believed him. I think watching him in that room, working through his own devastating recalibration of the last 2 years of his creative life, it would have been hard not to. This wasn't a man protecting himself. This was a man discovering that his own comeback, the thing he'd been publicly praised for as proof of pushing through severe writer's block, had actually been fed to him by someone he trusted, piece by piece, without his knowledge or consent. He sat back in his chair for a long moment, rubbing his face with both hands, and when he looked up again, something in his expression had settled into a kind of grim resolve. Nathaniel made a choice in that conference room that I think fundamentally changed the shape of everything that followed. Rather than retreating to protect his own reputation, he offered full cooperation. His own files, his correspondence with Diane, his own willingness to testify to exactly what he described to us that afternoon. "I built a career on being honest with readers about my process," he said. "I'm not going to protect a lie about this one, even if it costs me something. Probably especially because it would cost me something. That's kind of the whole point of integrity, isn't it?" With Nathaniel's cooperation, Priya's account, and the full textual and correspondence comparison, we filed a formal complaint with the Literary Agents Association's Ethics Board. Robert Fenn, the investigator assigned to the case, was a dry, thorough man who'd clearly seen every version of industry misconduct across 4 decades in publishing, and he walked us through the process with a kind of unhurried patience that felt, after everything, genuinely reassuring. "I've seen agents double deal clients before," he told us during our first meeting, "but rarely with documentation this clean. Most of these cases come down to he said, she said. Yours doesn't. That matters enormously for how quickly and decisively we can actually move." Fenn's investigation took nearly 2 months, confronting Diane directly with the accumulated evidence over what he described afterward as several increasingly tense meetings. According to what he later shared with us, her first response was to characterize the overlap as industry convergence, the theory that similar ideas simply emerge independently across different writers working in the same genre at the same time. "It's a real phenomenon, occasionally, cited often enough in publishing circles that it initially gave her explanation a surface plausibility. It did not remotely survive contact with her own dated revision emails, requesting specific structural changes to my manuscript that appeared, sometimes within weeks, in her instructions to Nathaniel framed as his own creative development. I wasn't in the room for that confrontation, But Fenn described watching Diane's composure, decades of careful, cultivated professional reputation, finally fail against the sheer specificity of her own written record. People can talk their way around almost anything, he told us afterward. It's much harder to talk your way around your own emails, especially when they're time-stamped down to the minute and directly contradict the story you're telling in the same room. He said that by the third meeting, she'd stopped offering explanations altogether, sitting largely silent while her own attorney tried, with diminishing conviction, to negotiate some lesser outcome. Diane was formally expelled from the Literary Agents Association within a month of that confrontation, and lost her position at her agency shortly after, her decades-long reputation as a discerning, trusted gatekeeper collapsing under the weight of documentation she herself had generated, never imagining it would eventually be read side by side with the manuscript it had actually come from. The resolution that followed involved a negotiated settlement between myself, Nathaniel's publisher, and Diane's former agency. Formal co-authorship credit for me on all future editions of the novel. Meaningful financial compensation reflecting the substantial portion of the book's core material that had originated in my own manuscript, and a public correction of the novel's actual origin story. Acknowledging the situation honestly rather than quietly sweeping it away. It's a strange thing, having your name finally printed on a book cover you never expected to see published at all, under circumstances no one would ever wish for. I think about that complexity often, the specific, disorienting mixture of vindication and grief that comes with a resolution like this one. 6 years of my own creative work exists in the world now. Reaching readers I always wanted to reach, just not in the way I ever imagined it would happen. I remember the first time I held a finished copy with the corrected credit page, my own name printed beneath Nathaniel's for the first time, and standing in my kitchen feeling something I can only describe as joy and loss arriving at exactly the same moment, neither one canceling the other out. Nathaniel and I have an ongoing professional relationship now, careful and still finding its shape, neither of us entirely sure what to call it. We've had several long conversations since that first meeting in Patricia's office, working through the strange, uncomfortable territory of two writers whose creative lives became entangled through no real choice of either of ours. He's been honest consistently in every conversation we've had, which I think matters more to me than I initially expected it to. We had lunch a few months ago, the first time we'd met outside a lawyer's conference room, and spent most of it talking not about the settlement or the investigation, but about craft, about the actual work of writing, two people who genuinely love the same thing finding an unexpected, complicated common ground. I don't know exactly what our working relationship will look like going forward, but I've come to believe it's possible to build something genuine out of circumstances this complicated, provided both people involved are willing to actually be honest about how it happened. Priya left her position at the publishing house about 6 months after everything concluded, taking a job at a smaller press with what she described to me as more transparent editorial practices. I think, in her own way, the experience changed how she saw parts of an industry she'd otherwise trusted completely. We still talk occasionally. She asked me recently to look at a manuscript from a debut writer she's now championing herself, and I found myself reading it with a kind of protective care I don't think I would have brought to the task before any of this happened. I started writing again about 4 months ago, something new, entirely my own this time, and I noticed myself thinking differently about the entire process now. Less willing to accept vague, endlessly deferred feedback as simply the nature of the industry, more willing to ask direct questions about where my work is actually going and why. Marcus has noticed the difference too. You sound different when you talk about the new book, he told me recently. More like yourself, less like you're apologizing for wanting something. I think he's right, though it took me a long time and a very strange set of circumstances to hear that difference in my own voice. I've learned the hard way that not ready yet can mean exactly what it says. It can also mean something else entirely, dressed up carefully enough that it takes 6 years and a chance airplane flight to finally see the difference. I don't think I'll ever fully stop wondering how many other writers have heard those exact same words in that exact same warm, sympathetic, professionally devastating tone, and simply believe them the way I did, for exactly as long as I did, without ever getting the strange, improbable chance I got to find out otherwise. She spent 6 years convincing me my book wasn't ready for the world. She just never planned for the world to hand it back to me anyway, with my own name finally printed where it always should have been.